Hi, this is Dr. Marcia Anderson with the Center of Expertise for School IPM. I have the pleasure of being your moderator for today's program. I would first like to thank you all for joining us. Today's webinar will discuss how to manage bats on school grounds and how to be proactive in your approach to bat management. Integrated pest management is all about preventing pests, and in this case, bats, and the transmission of potentially dangerous bat-related illnesses and preparing your school for bat encounters. It's important to know exactly what your school should be doing if, when, and where bats enter your building or are found on school grounds. Protecting the health of children is a priority for the Environmental Protection Agency. Children face increased risks to their health when they are unnecessarily exposed to pests and pesticides. For this reason, EPA recommends that all schools implement programs that promote both the safe use of pesticides and integrated pest management. IPM encourages long-term, sustainable approaches to successfully manage pests. By developing a coordinated IPM program, school leaders demonstrate their commitment to promoting a healthy environment where students are more productive. I now have the privilege of announcing our knowledgeable presenters for this webinar. Dr. John Hermanson is professor at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Cornell University. Mr. Jeremy Thoreau, the Energy Coordinator for Ascension Public Schools in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Mr. Ricardo Zubiate is the Assistant Director of Facility Services with the Salt Lake City School District in Utah. Mrs. Diane Odegaard is the Education and Public Outreach Manager for Bat Conservation International. Dr. Hermanson will begin the webinar with some important general information on bats.
So I'm pleased to be with you. What I'm trying to do is talk a little bit about where I've seen bats, where I encounter them, how I work with them, and a little bit about some bats you might find in school buildings throughout the country. They wind up in the wrong places. And I was called to a house here in Ithaca maybe about 2 months ago. This bat, as you can see, is outside the glass window and inside the screen, so it was simple for me to grab the bat and get the bat out of the house. These big brown bats, they do a swarming behavior before they go into hibernation. And at this time, we get a lot of the teenagers, or that's really not the right word, but the bats were maybe born in June of this year, and they stay out too late at night, and they wind up looking for a place to go into torpor for the day, and they wind up in a house. They maybe go in through an open window. In this case, they could have been in the attic of the house. Older construction often has the old sash cord windows that have a little opening at the top. It just takes an opening about the size of a dime to get a bat like this into the living area of the house. Then the question has to be, do we have to worry about whether or not there was an exposure? In this case, the bat was seen in the daylight. There had been no exposure. The bat had not been in a bedroom or anything like that. And so he flew just fine, and it was kind of a happy story. Where do we normally find bats besides in the windows of our houses? Many of the North American bats are probably cave dwellers. In the wintertime, actually this time of year, late October, bats here in New York have probably already made their migration and are in caves or in mines for their hibernation bout. It'll go from now probably into the 1st of April, or depending on how the spring is next year, it could be toward the end of April before they emerge. But there seems to be an important link between many of our North American bats and caves, or in the case of human activity, in the case of mines. We provide a very nice opportunity for these bats to overwinter. Many North American bats are probably in the trees, and so we'll talk about this more as I go ahead. There can be openings in a tree trunk, for example, made by woodpeckers. That allows the bat's entry into the tree buttress. Provides a pretty good thermally stable environment. They're protected from the rain. It's dark. It's all these things that bats like. This bat at the right here is shown on the bark of a tree, and there's often gaps in the bark of old trees. So here you can see the bark is flaking off of the tree, and this makes for surfaces between the sloughing off bark and the outside part of the hardwood where the bats become pretty comfortable. What about dwelling in our schools? We don't want them in our schools. Many of the North American bats were either cave dwellers or tree dwellers. And then we had the European people moving into North America and building structures. This could have been true of the Pueblo Indians, too, in the southwestern part of the United States. I would argue that probably these guys are moving into a new niche. It provides a dark space. It provides protection from the rain and the wind. So just like they live in the holes in the tree, bats have moved pretty readily into structures that humans have built. They love living in attics. People don't usually go up in their attics, so it's a dark space. It's protected from the elements. And so this is what would introduce this as a problem. How do we twist this into how do bats move into schools? A lot of this will probably have to do with a combination of a couple of things, including the construction techniques that are being used at a particular time. On the image there to the right, you can see a bat trying to get in and out of a louvered vent, perhaps in the attic of a building. Looks like they've put some hardware cloth in the inside. If that hardware cloth is not small enough in its mesh, this bat will have an easy time getting in and out of this. I was just at a bat conference in San Antonio, and there was an incredible presentation about maternity roosts. That's where the bats go and have their babies. So all the females get together and they form what we call a maternity roost or a maternity aggregation. And inside a louvered vent, just like I'm showing you here, is where these big brown bats were roosting, were having their babies, were spending probably 3 months of their life. And it was beautiful because you could see it so well. The presenter actually had a very nice set of videos about what was going on with these bats. If we have bats in the school, how should we remove them and at what cost? I'm not really going to get into that. I'm going to talk more about where we find bats, and I'm going to leave the removal and the cost and all that to a couple of the other presenters. And in a way, I think Diane and I are bookends in this presentation. I'm of the opinion that these bats are normally out of our way. They're not causing harm to people, and they do tremendous benefit in terms of the ecosystem around us. And some of that we can translate into actual dollars in terms of where these bats live and what they're up to. These are free-tailed bats. The genus is Pteridata, species Braziliensis. This is a bat species that is found, as the name implies, from Brazil in the extreme south, right up through, you can see the range map on the right, right up through Oregon on the west, up into the midsection, maybe into Ohio in the east, although I don't think they're very common up there. They're found in Florida. They're found across the whole nation down into Mexico. It's a very highly distributed species. These are unique bats, but you can see in the sketch to the left, the free tail, that's where the name comes from. It almost looks like a mouse tail. There's a little tail membrane between the hind legs. This is where they often catch their insect prey. They catch the insect prey basically by trawling. They drag this little membrane like a fishing boat would have a net dragged behind it. You can see the little hairs on the foot there. So they have a tactile receptor that tells them when they contact the insect in flight. They basically flex their body, catch the insect in that web, bring it up to their mouth, and then they keep feeding. These are migratory bats. They live in places like Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, primarily in the summertime. And then in the winter, they migrate to warmer habitats. These bats do not hibernate, so they move into warmer climates where they continue foraging throughout the year. So they can have a very long migratory cycle. So this is one bat I'll give you an example of. Another bat, and I showed you the picture of this one in the house right at the outset. This is the big brown bat, and you can see in the range map to the right, extremely extensive throughout all of North America, extends up into Canada, probably a little further than is indicated in this map. This is taken from an old citation, Schwartz and Schwartz. This is 1981. It's an excellent book if you just need to figure out what the bat is that you might have in the belfry. So there are some very good illustrations of this. The point of this is very much like the free-tail bat I just showed you. This is a winged animal. It's not a mouse. It's not anything like that. Bats are in their own group, the Chiroptera, and they're distinct because they have this beautiful wing membrane that is spread between their digits. So if you look at that wing in the middle of the slide, you can see a little thumb sticking out in the front, and then you can count the fingers, 5 just like you and I have. It's just an elegant little mammal in terms of how they're built. These are insect eaters. They primarily like to feed on beetles. So they probably are helpful in terms of fighting off some of the tree bark beetle type outbreaks we're fighting out in the west. Here's the little brown bat. The genus is Myotis, the species Lucifugus. This is the bat that you've heard about in the news in the last few years. It's been devastated by a disease, something we call white nose syndrome. It's called white nose because when they're afflicted with this, it's usually in hibernation, and when you look at them, it looks like they have a white nose. It looks like a little Grinch with a feathery mustache of white. Those are the little parts of the fungus that have actually penetrated the skin around their mouth and are growing outwards, and it gives them this little appearance like they have a white beard. But again, the little brown bats, just like the other ones, has beautiful wing membrane. These animals weigh about 7 to 10 grams. They're not very big. They can get in and out of houses easily. I have many maternity roosts I've followed here in New York. We often have populations of, say, 400, 500, or 600 females, all roosting either in bat boxes or in barns. So where do we find these? This is an example of one of the trips we did 2008 when white nose syndrome had first come out. I was traveling with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and Al Hicks, and we had a team of people going in to see if white nose could be seen in the little brown bats inhabiting this mine up in the Adirondack Mountains. And so it's a cold world. You see, we're all pretty well dressed. These animals are hibernating at temperatures just above the freezing point, so from about 0 to 5 degrees Celsius. So it's cold and it's dark. It takes about 40 minutes to walk from the outside of the cave into where these animals are hibernating, so they're pretty well protected. These are some bats that have a little bit of ice in their body, but some of these will also have the white nose fungal elements as well. And this next picture shows it. If you look at the wings, this is a picture of 3 bats hanging upside down, and you can see 3 sets of wings kind of going from about 11 o'clock to 5 o'clock in these pictures, and you can see the little white spots on them. This is an indication of the white nose fungus. The problem with white nose is it attacks when the bats are hibernating. It attacks when they're most suppressed in terms of their immune system, and it devastates the skin of the wing and other parts of the body to the point that they desiccate. They dry out. They keep waking up because they're uncomfortable. They burn off all of their fat reserves, and as by January, they have burned probably half of that fat stores for the winter, and they just can't survive until spring brings insects and warm weather to the outside. White nose syndrome was first discovered on this map. This is New England to the right and New York kind of to the left, Pennsylvania below that. You can see the black triangle. This is up toward Albany, New York. This is where the first case of white nose was found. I work over there in central New York where all the red dots are. And the example I want to give you is that over 90% of the bats that should be in all of these maternity roosts, based on our data from 2005 and earlier, 95% of these bats are no longer there. In other words, there's only about 4 to 5% of the bats should have of the species Myotis lucificus. So it's devastating. So these bats need some friends. So if you're going to knock them out of the schools, we need to do it carefully and appreciate the good that these animals do. So bats live in trees. We can talk about trees. We can talk about old growth trees that we don't have a whole lot of anymore. This is a tree I can't even put my arms around here in the Ithaca, New York area. Lots of bats, especially migratory ones that I'm not going to say much about. The genus is Laziurus, silver-haired bat, the red bat. There's a hoary bat as well. These often are tree bats. They migrate great distances, so they may overwinter in the south of the United States or in Mexico, and then they'll spend their summers in the breeding season up in Canada. So they're pretty interesting bats, but they desperately need trees. There was a nice study done back in the 1970s by Steve Humphrey at the University of Florida, and he showed the importance of trees, that is forested areas of North America, with distributions of North American bats. So we think that trees were really important in terms of especially the summer habits or summer roost sites of these bats. You think back to the 1800s, at least here in New York, in places 90% of the forests were clear cut. So we probably did quite a bit of damage to the bats, but this is the time they moved into the barns and the outbuildings that we provided for them. Currently, we do a lot of our studies in central New York. This image is showing a couple of my students standing up by a bat box up on a utility pole. This is a double box. You can see we're in the center of agricultural country. There's a lot of corn growing around here. Behind me, and taking this picture, is the Chemung River. It's a broad river. A lot of insect available to the little brown bats here. This box used to have about 300 to 400 little brown bats in it. No more. In the last 3 years, we've had no bats whatsoever. So bats are really under stress. So how about in in-built structures? So I've been talking a little bit about barns and outbuildings and things like that. Fear, if they get into schools or they get into your house and they start flying around in your kitchen, you don't want that. We need to think about what the positive things are about these bats and maybe not be quite as afraid of them as we are. I'll show you a couple of pictures, including the problem here locally. We had bats in a church. The problem was, while everybody was going to their church service and left their kids in the nursery, the bats were flying around. That got people upset. Farm bats I'm not so worried about. Suburban bats, bats in attics, etc. Let's get on to what we're here to talk about a little bit. I can't show you a lot of pictures of bats in schools, but here's a barn. This barn used to have about 600 to 800 bats living in the summer. I showed you the same bat box earlier. That might have a couple hundred bats, 300 bats in it at the same time. As long as they're in the barn, I'm not so worried. If they got into the White House that's located behind it, then we might have to do some integrated management to control the situation. Here's another barn. It's not really used. It's certainly not used for occupation. This in one time had about 350 bats in it as a maternity roost. Currently the number is more like 0. Again, I'm emphasizing that these structures illustrate the sort of the danger these bats are in, the little bat in terms of their possible extinction, if you will. Extinction could be a real thing. Here's another one. It's about 450 bats, no bats left there anymore. This house, this is interesting. We used to have bats in the barn located next to this house, and then the little brown bats started moving into the porch. Not into the porch itself, but this porch has a metal roof on it. And metal roofs are great for bats because metal roofs make a hot microenvironment. And these bats, when they're pregnant, really like to have a hot environment. By having the demise of Windows syndrome, the bats moved. They were in smaller numbers. They started living in the edge of the house. We started seeing big brown bats in the attic of this house. So there's a lot of potential for human infections. So we need to be a little bit careful in terms of advising the owner of the house what to do. The owner has been really good about doing renovations, especially in the wintertime when there's no bats around. And I think we've seen good success in moving the big brown bats out of the attic. You can see there's a big brown bat flying there, kind of real small in this image. They live in great places. This is a resort, according to many people. For little brown bats, this is heaven because there's lots of insects in the edge of the swamp. Here's a barn where they would live. It used to be 350 to 600 bats given different seasons living up in here. Again, no bats. The big point of what I'm saying is we need to be a little careful about what we do with these bats because they are under tremendous stress in terms of their exposure to an epidemic disease. So we have to be real careful of that. This gives you an idea of what they're looking for. This is in the barn. So these bats are about 30 feet over my head, and there are probably 42 big brown bats lined up in the rafter there. So they don't need a lot of space to live in a place like this. This is a post office, and it used to have about 300 bats living in the attic. And if I went back to the 1990s, the postmaster said to me, it's really hard to do good customer service when you're talking to a customer and there's a bat flying behind them. So they were able to do some careful management in terms of exclusion. During the wintertime, they were able to close up the openings in the attic, usually located in the soffits or at the end points, the corner of these places, and they put a bat house in the back, and that seemed to move the bats happily out into another environment, and it made the postal customers a lot happier as well. This is the box that they put in. 326 bats used to live in the post office building. There's no bats there now. And there are a handful of little brown bats using this as a maternity roost. So we've accomplished something here to help move the bats. You can look through these slides on your own. It'll give you some numbers, but it shows you these bats are under a lot of stress. They like to live in human structures. This is where we found a maternity roost about 5 years ago. Very small numbers, nothing to put the homeowners at risk. It was a pretty valuable place. It worked out good for the humans and for the bats. These are big brown bats. They're feeding on beetles. They're probably doing a good job in the environment. That's the attic of that house. So you have a few pictures to look at. This is kind of a scrawny looking big brown bat, but I was nose to nose with this guy while I was looking around trying to count. This is all you need. The size of a dime that lets them get in and out of these attics or workspaces. This is interesting. This is a barn where the owner had trouble with the bats being in the barn, so she put in a couple of these openings here and put bat boxes on the inside of the barn. And so this was pretty well adapted to by the bats. Here's a school. This is as close as I'll get. This is my own college here at Cornell. We took the windows off this year to put up new glass. And in the course of this, we left some openings. I'll put an arrow in here to show you what I'm talking about. But up here, there were some openings in the insulation that the construction workers had left in place. And these bats were willy-nilly flying through the corridors of our building for a couple of weeks until we got them to kind of tighten up some of these crevices. So this is how they get in. It's pretty easy for them to do this. And you need to pay attention to your structure and what we're doing. I've talked about this. Bat boxes seem to help us relocate bats from human dwellings to an exterior location. This has to be done carefully. It provides space to kind of maintain the populations you have, and I think these are very important as we move forward with white nose syndrome. This is looking up in the bat box, and you can see a few of the noses looking down at you. There's probably, when I took this, I think we had 85 bats living up in that one crevice that I'm showing you there. What are the benefits? I'm not going to go into this in detail. I'll let Diane kind of fill it up. But if a bat that's 10 grams consumes half their body weight in insects every night, you can imagine that's pretty important. So they're important as what we like to call now ecosystem services providers. They control insect populations. They probably are controlling some of the insect reservoirs that may be responsible for human disease. We're all thinking about Zika right now. Well, if you can knock down some of the mosquito populations, I think that will be good. But look at this bottom line. There was a study that was done by Boyles et al. About 2011, I believe, it was published in Science magazine. Bats may save agriculture in the United States as much as $3 to $53 billion per year. That's in terms of the reduced cost of agricultural pesticides that need to be applied to the crops. That's pretty staggering. 150 big brown bats could consume as many as 1.3 million insects. Just think of that. These bats can radiate out quite a distance from their neighbors. Remember, these are the big brown, these are the free-tail bats that I first showed you a picture of. This is what we find down in Texas and places like Bracken Cave. We find in Carlsbad Caverns caves out in New Mexico, where they live in populations of up to 3 to 5 million bats. So think of the impact these bats are having on the cotton fields in that area or here and there. That is all I want to do, and I will transition to the next speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Hermanson, for your enlightening presentation on bats and bat harborage. Next up is Jeremy Thoreau, who will describe the challenges the Ascension Parish School District faced when bats called some of their buildings home. Jeremy, take it away.
Good evening. I'm Jeremy Theriault with Ascension Public Schools, and I work in the maintenance department. We have approximately 22,000 students, about 3,000 employees, and approximately 30 schools. We're located in Ascension Parish, or county, as many of you know it. We are right between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. We're going to talk to you today about the challenges we face with bats in a few of our facilities, and with a better understanding of how bats get into facility and what it takes to get them out, you can better understand how to keep them out, which is what we really want to do. We have been practicing integrated pest management since the mid to late 2000s. The main IPM tool that we have with bats is to prevent or remove their harborage. The old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, could not be more true than when dealing with bats. Bats in our schools presents a different challenge than when bats get into other buildings like a barn. For us, bats have been limited to the free-tail species, although we do have big brown bats in the area, and they favor taller structures, usually a 2-story building, and then they also favor areas near heavy light pollution, such as athletic fields. One of the things we see with the athletic field is light pollution. Those metal halide lights produce a lot of glow upward. With that glow upward, it attracts insects, and the bats come and feed on it. Well, when that's on the school campus, we wind up getting the bats that decide it looks like a good place to make homes, so they move on in. And one of the things that I believe is going to kind of help with that is the new LED light fixtures. They're focusing that light more downward, so it doesn't produce as much pollution. This is a taller gym, so what we've had was a unique challenge with a small bat colony. And what we've looked at was how do we get them out. At the time, they were with young, and we decided that we had to get them out when they were no longer with young. And the solution we come up with is to do some construction modifications where we put new soffits on this building. So we designed the project, bid it out, and that process took us almost 2 months to get completed. During that time, the young finished growing and moved on out. We were left with a few bats inside of this gym, so at that point we had less to deal with. You can see the blocks did not go all the way up to the deck, so what it resulted in was a continuous opening all the way around. And this is where the bats ducked into. It was difficult to exclude it, and then we also had to repair all of those areas. We wound up coming in there and started where we knew the bats were coming and going because it was limited to one particular area, even though that construction detail lasted around the entire building. So we started there. We started working our way around, filling up the soffit. And when we got back to a point where we felt comfortable stopping, we stopped, and we began using some exclusionary work there. One of the things we used in particular on this site was an ultrasonic device. We have used it with success. I've heard mixed results with it. But we've used it with some success. You have to make sure you have enough speakers, they're positioned right. There's many different details. But what we did in this particular case, we allowed the bats to fly out at night. We would go in as they leave, and we turn the device on. When they come back, they turn and leave. And what I've seen myself, I've watched bat after bat come up to where that point of entry was, and if those speakers are right, they'll turn around and go right out. I've seen them where we had to adjust the speaker slightly to get them to go away and not come back to that one particular area. So after we did that, we waited a couple of days to make sure we didn't have any more bats in the area, leaving the device on. And once we knew we were clear, no more bats at night, we were able to come in and seal up that remaining section, and then that exclusion work was done. This is a picture of the completed work now. You'll see on the left-hand side the new panels where we put in the soffits to replace it. It looks a lot more pleasing. Along the edges, we made sure we had good, tight joints, and then we come back and caulk those joints to make sure we had them extra tight. On the right-hand side, you'll see the gutter. It's kind of a silver or stainless gutter that goes up toward the top. There's a little spot right here. We actually had a roof drain that penetrated the roof, kicked back to the gutter, and then down. So we had to get creative there, boxing that in nice and tight on there to where the bats couldn't get up inside of that area as well. So one of the things I talked about with some of our solutions on this site, originally we found minimal guano. Occasionally we found them in the gym. They typically went to the outside, and they used a single point of entry even though it was continuous. So they were living actually above that block wall between it and that roof deck, just in that little void up there. And then as we did morning inspections, we cleaned up if we chose to occupy the gym. Site number 2. This is a high school we dealt with. This is a picture we found on the internet that shows the extent of guano that can be found on a school site. What we had on this particular site was 500 linear foot of gutter between 2 different buildings. Bats were living behind that gutter. There was a daily accumulation of guano outside, such that after a day or so, we'd come back, and it was almost a full dustpan that we would sweep up before the kids or teachers ever got there. If there was an occasional bat found inside, we would remove it and release it to the outside. What we found is that it was a significant impact to our students. The last thing we want to do is close the facility where we're trying to educate our students, especially considering that these 2 buildings that was involved included 2 gyms, a weight room, locker rooms, choir room, and band. We did wind up voluntarily closing that gym for approximately 2 weeks while we were doing some construction in the area, just to make sure we didn't have any issues. The authorities having jurisdiction came in, and they were looking at how we were handling the bats and the cleanup and make sure that everything was safe. Sometimes those authorities having jurisdiction run into limitations. On this particular site, they recognized that their approach didn't fit the standard protocol that was given. And at that point, they deferred us to some of our local university professors as well as Louisiana Wildlife Fisheries. We had an agent come out, wildlife agent, and met with us to make sure that the methods that we were using, we were doing the right thing and give us any advice. And we agreed that we were taking the best possible approach we could. The other challenge we run into is the odor of guano and ammonia. And for anybody that smelled it, they realize it is a very unique smell. is one that you don't forget. So this is that same high school that I was just talking about. You'll see the picture up in the center. That's the two buildings there between A and B. There's two white lines at the edge of that building. That is where the gutters were. It's a rather large building. You'll see a circle around the school bus in the bottom left of that picture. On the left-hand side, bottom left picture, that is looking between those two buildings from the left. And then on the bottom right is looking from the right. You'll see that the building in the middle is rather wide, and then on the right-hand side, that canopy coming in there. We wound up having to get a 120-foot man lift and also some 40s in trying to get in between those structures to be able to work it. And we actually had some guys working on the roof, tied off and OSHA approved, but they had to work from on the roof, kind of leaning over the edge for one tight section there. What you see on this is a detail of the issues and kind of a solution. What we had is where the gutter was mounted to the building, the original construction left off where this green board is. And you'll see on here, this green board was not there. So what it presented was a nice void. We also didn't have this yellow, orange, or purple area. So basically what the contractor did is the gray area that shows the gutter, he put it over where the green board was, and there was a nice little void. So essentially what he created was 500 linear foot of bat house. So what we wound up having to do is come in and remove the gutters. Before we removed those gutters, we hung visqueen about 4 or 5 foot down. We put some ultrasonic devices on there. And what that allowed us to do is the bats come out at night, they dropped down, and they flew away. When they came back, they would hit the visqueen that was attached to the gutter and couldn't figure out how to get up behind there. So it allowed a lot of them to come out that way. We had a few issues where the visqueen was blowing around, so we also used it in conjunction with the ultrasonic devices to help us. Started with an area we were working, and we started removing that gutter. So if we knew that we were going to work a portion, say the first 150 foot we planned to remove in a day's time, we would start making sure the bats were out of that area with the ultrasonic devices as well as the visqueen, and we removed that gutter. And what we found is where that green board is sitting, kind of where that red arrow pointing to it is, there's a shelf right there. We had some guano on it. We were able to sweep it up, kind of do a little bit of cleanup as we went along. Luckily for us, we didn't have a lot of guano in the building because of this construction detail. It basically fell right out from underneath the gutter down to the ground. So what we did in here, we come back, you'll see this yellow fastener, or continuous cleat as we call it. This runs the entire length of the building, and this kind of grayish purple area here, this flashing wrapped underneath that cleat. So by screwing the orange cleat directly to the building and wrapping the flashing around it, they could no longer get back to where that green board is. We also added that green board to fill that void. Original gutters were so tight, I could not even get the tip of my finger behind it, maybe not even half my finger behind the gutter. It was so tight on the building. So I was surprised at how tight a space the bats could squeeze into. We wound up putting up new gutters and everything, and we were able to move forward and didn't have bats at that site anymore. The other thing we had to do on this particular site, you'll see where we had a 1 by 2 inch area underneath the gutters. The architect put this detail in here. You'll also see where they got that flashing that we dealt with. So we added in that little 1 by 2 strip. We screwed it into place and then caulked it nice and tight to where we didn't have to have an additional opening to deal with for the bats. The finished detail, that cleat and continuous flashing was underneath it so that the bats didn't get back into that area. And it was interesting because that one detail, missing that flashing, we had other gutters that did not have that flashing missing on this campus, and no issues in 4 or 5 years with bats. Where this particular site, we actually had bats behind these gutters twice. We were able to get them out once without realizing where they were living. Second time around is when it got extensive. And so with this one here, we had to do a daily cleanup of guano on the ground. We used the visqueen, the ultrasonic devices to get them out. And then we removed the old gutters, cleaned up anything behind it, and installed those additional construction materials. This is a site I wanted to talk just a little bit about. We really didn't have bats in this building that moved in and took up residence, but what we did have was an occasional bat. So we get a phone call that says, hey, we got a bat or two that we found in the building. We come in, remove the bats, release them to outside. At that point, we inspected the buildings, couldn't find anything, do daytime, nighttime inspections, no issues. We had a couple suspected points of entry that we sealed up. For the last 3 years, we typically get one complaint a year, but we can't find a point of entry. And when we do remove that bat, there's no more reoccurrence. So we're not really sure what's going on, if they're attracted to that building, but something's there. We seal up any other possible entry points that we may think would be an issue. And the last complaint we got was actually a single bat, and it was clinging to the exterior wall during the day. So perhaps we sealed them out. And this little guy was hanging on the wall outside. We removed it and put it over by the wooded area adjacent, which is perhaps where the bats are coming from occasionally. So this is our approach. When we receive a complaint, if it's indoors, we'll remove that bat, bring it to outside. We'll do daytime inspections, and we look for guano. We look for points of possible entry. Is there a hole big enough for a bat to go in? And then we look at signs at an entry. In particular, grease rubs. When those bats come in and out, the oils on their fur rub off on those points of entries, and you'll see that grease rub, which is usually a telltale sign. And then with the guano, sometimes it's not just the visual, sometimes it's the smell. You know, I've done inspections where I've suspected bats and stuck my nose up there, and sure enough, they had just moved in, and you could smell them inside the cavity, but there was no guano on the ground. It had rained the night before. Perhaps the rain washed it off. And then we also do nighttime inspections. Typically for this, we bring in a pest control company that has a nuisance license, and they'll usually get 2 or 4 people depending on the size of the building, and they'll look at all 4 corners or just 2 corners opposite or diagonal of each other, and we'll do an inspection where they show up about 30 minutes, 45 minutes before dark, and they stay to about 90 minutes after sunset and see what they find. Usually we'll get a good idea if we have bats on a building. We may repeat this for a couple of nights if necessary, and then I ask them to report the findings in a field report, and we document that and hold on to it. A lot of times you'll get a complaint with a school that a parent or something had an issue. Are you doing anything about this? Because I heard we had a bat in the school. So that documentation can go a long way to help the administration staff at that particular school. If we find any areas that we suspect are possible entry points, after we do a couple night entries and we're confident that there's no bats coming and going and that they're not just up there and they didn't come out tonight because of maybe it was colder temperatures or whatever the situation may be, then we'll go ahead and seal it up. The good thing is we like to take a proactive approach. We'll respond a lot of times with a single bat. We find that it's definitely helpful. What we've had is 3 sites where we've dealt with bats in our schools. They present challenges to get them out, such as the construction modifications and any daily cleanup before the students and teachers arrive. And then there's a financial cost. Now, altogether, over the first 2 sites, we have spent over $250,000 dealing with bats. The first site alone was over $70,000 with just the simple soffit repairs. So when people ask me about bats, my response is that it can get expensive to seal up a building and prevent bats on school grounds, but it is a drop in the bucket compared to how expensive it can be to get them out once they take up residency. Thank you.
We learned a lot about bat exclusion from Mr. Terrio. Next, to discuss the ordeal that the Salt Lake City School District experienced for numerous years when hundreds of bats went to high school, is Ricardo Zubiate. Ricardo, it's all yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a presentation of our bat experience, and what I'm going to be doing is basically telling you a story and walk you through a timeline of our bat experience. West High School is our oldest school, established in 1890. This structure that you see in the picture was built in 1922, and that is the current structure that we are working with. For over 35 years that I know, because I've been in the system for 35 years now, we know that we have Mexican free-tail bats in this location. And what was going on every year, the bats would come in during the month of September, October, and sometimes into November, and they would migrate in and out of our building. And they were using West High School as a stopping grounds on their migration. That's all we can think about, because we really don't deal with them during the school year or the summertime. Sometimes in the spring we do. So 2 times of the season of the year, they show up to West High School, and that was in the fall, where we get the highest number of bats, and then also in the springtime, although there was less number of sightings during the springtime. In the 1980s and 90s, the custodians would arm themselves with butterfly nets, and they would go in early morning hours, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, to remove over 2,000 bats a night that they would get from inside the building and release them outside. They practice a catch and release operation during this whole period of time. They would do this in order to avoid student and bat contact, because the number of bats that we were experiencing on a nightly basis, there was just too many for us to just leave in the building. We weren't able to remove all of them, though. I mean, some of the bats would stay behind, of course, because it was impossible to gather over 2,000 bats and that would come into the building during that period of time. So somehow the staff in the school and the students and the bats somehow peacefully coexisted, although there was less bats because of the work that the custodial staff would do during this period of time. That was then, though, because it was different times, and definitely before today's media blitz, because we all know that today's world has, it's a little bit more intrusive in the fact that every news agency out there is looking for a story. In 2005, we were introduced to IPM practices by Dr. Mark Lame from Indiana University. About the same period of time, I was named the custodial supervisor / IPM coordinator for the Salt Lake City School District. I was very fortunate to have been able to meet and work with Dr. Mark Lane, who taught me a lot on how to deal with pests. So in 2005-2006 school year, I decided and made the principals learn to deal with the bats at West High School. And this is when we started dealing with them in a different way than we used to do before, which was catch and release. It was a monumental task, considering the size of the building and, more importantly, the age of the building. And so the maintenance department at the time told me that it was an impossible task, and they basically said, good luck. So that fall, I received my first phone call. Custodians had been at the football game during the night, and they had witnessed bats flying into a roof drain way above the building. And so they notified me and let me know that they have seen this. And so I went up there and met with the teacher in that building and went and investigated what was happening. As I got there, I talked to him and I asked him if he had seen any bats in his classroom. He said, no, there has been no bats, but there's this funny odor. It's very strong, particularly in the mornings, and the smell would fade later on during the day as students came in and out. So I decided to get a ladder and start investigating and looking at the area, and realized that I found the roof drain pipe that the custodians have reported seeing bats coming into. If you look at that picture, you can see the pipe, and it's a roof drain that goes into the outside of the building, but that's the area where the bats were coming in. After further investigating the area, see a red arrow that is pointing directly to that sheetrock wall. When I started looking into it, this is that same area. Now from the top looking down, we found dead bats, and that was creating the odor in that classroom. And so we had to break away the sheetrock and get those dead bats and remove them. We also sealed the area that the bats were coming into the classroom from the roof drain pipe. That was just something that we had to look, investigate, and figure out. Another call that I received was a classroom that had a very strong smell of bat guano. And applying, again, the principles of IPM is using all your senses to figure out where the problem is. In this classroom, we found an area that the bats were not only coming into, but they were also roosting. For that reason, they had a lot of bat guano that had accumulated above this attic space. I'm pointing to an area where bats were coming in. We ended up sealing that area, as you could see. We also had to hire a hazardous waste management contractor to help us remove the bat guano, which they did. If you could see, this is the picture afterwards. And you could see that two things have happened here. The bat guano was removed, and the area was sealed so that the bats wouldn't come back in. There was some bats that were still lingering around. As you could see, some of the new and clean areas were already starting to show and produce some bat guano, which tends to happen because this is something that takes time to deal with. One of the things that you have to keep in mind trying to remove bats, it's not an easy task, especially when they've been doing this for years. One of the things that you have to take into consideration and the time that it has taken us, and with a building that's over 500,000 square feet in size, it wasn't an easy task, especially when you heard one of the other presenters that bats need a dime size of an entry point to get into your building. So think about a building this size and trying to go through the entire building and sealing the areas where the bats are coming in. We are fortunate that our bats were not coming in and staying with us. They come in and during the fall, and they make their presence known to us during this period of time, and then also a little bit in the springtime. So we have a lot of other times that we were able to get in there and look and take each part of the building and carefully seal some of the areas that we would find in locations. We started having success with this, and by the year 2011, we declared total success because we get reports of 2 to 3 bats a year now. For example, this season we had 2 bats so far, and right now we're almost at the end of the migratory season for us because normally by November they stop showing up. If you're dealing with bats, keep in mind that it takes time. It took us a good 4 to 5 years of doing this. Remember, we're all looking for the silver bullet, something to fix instantly and right away. Well, it doesn't happen that way. You have to actually invest time, and you have to take each area and do what you can before you move on to the next area. So we eventually did. We did the entire school, starting at the south end of the school and working our way all the way around the entire facility to get this job done. And this was done mostly by the custodial department leadership team, the supervisors. I was the custodial supervisor at the time. I had 2 assistants working with me. We did not want to give more added work to the maintenance department. We also didn't want to involve our custodial staff in that high school because they have a job to do themselves. So 3 of us scheduled ourselves throughout the years to take an area of the building and go through it thoroughly to make sure we cover the areas where the bats were coming in. So as far as cost, we really didn't attach any cost to it because the job was being done by us. We would schedule ourselves 1 or 2 days out of the week to go and do this. We did rent a lift, and a lot of the time was just absorbed within the custodial department leadership team to get the job done. We also installed bat condos above the roof of this very high facility with nobody being able to, only authorized personnel being able to get up there. And so the first time we tried this, we did this wrong because we didn't place the bat condos on the right side of those walls. You want to find the south where bat condos are going to get the most amount of sun. I hope that story gave you an idea of what we've gone through from the particular building in 1922, and then in the 80s and 90s, how custodians tried to minimize impact with students. And then what we started doing in 2005 after learning how to deal with any kind of pest using the integrated pest management processes and procedures. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zubiate, for sharing your school bat story. Next, we have Diane Odegaard, who will give us detailed information about bat exclusion and precautions when bats have moved in.
Thank you very much, Marcia. I work for Bat Conservation International here in Austin, Texas, and we are a conservation organization, but we try to help people to better coexist with bats. The concern that we have regarding bats in buildings is that many very common bat species are becoming very vulnerable, and part of the reason for this is threats to bats that have existed for a long time, like loss of habitat and general disturbance. But newer threats like white nose syndrome and wind turbines have appeared in the last number of years and have killed millions of bats. Now, those bat deaths are fairly well documented and well quantified. However, another threat to bats is poorly planned exclusion processes when bats are in buildings. It can be done badly, causing direct or indirect mortality. It can definitely be accidental and inadvertent. But the high numbers of deaths from white nose syndrome and wind turbines are easier to convince people about the seriousness of those issues. Mortality of bats in buildings tends to happen quietly and in secret. Buildings, of course, give bats the same things that buildings give humans: warm, stable temperatures, microclimate options, protection from the outside world, whether it be predators or salesmen, crevices in the case of crevice roosting bats, and of course bats use buildings as replacement roosts, sometimes when they have been excluded from other buildings. And to a bat, a crevice in a bridge or a building is not that different from a crevice behind, for instance, loose bark on a tree where some bats roost. Where do bats get into buildings? Well, they can get into any space that is about a ½ an inch. And one thing that you can use a hallmark on this is the pinky test. If you can get your little finger into a hole or a crack, it's very likely that a bat can probably get in as well. Some of the areas where bats get in are documented in this little graphic. Basically, it's any place where two different materials come together, or where there is a junction of some kind, where a dormer meets the roof shingles. Behind downspouts and gutters, that's not always an entrance, but sometimes bats will roost there. Torn window screens, broken siding, eaves and soffit vents that are not in good repair. And chimney caps are a very, very common place for bats and all kinds of other animals, actually, to get in. So why do they get in? You know, if it's a single bat, it's often a lost youngster, or sometimes a bat will actually fly into a building chasing an insect. The moth that bat might be chasing is attracted to light. Now, bats aren't, but they're very attracted to moths. If there's an active colony somewhere in the building, sometimes bats will accidentally get in from an attic through a space in the attic door or under the attic door. There are all kinds of places where they can get in. In large buildings like stadiums, special event type buildings like the Frank Irwin Center here, which is in Austin, Texas, where they have musical events, they have theater, they have a lot of basketball games. And sometimes bats will get in up around the top of this building, usually under loose lashing. But of course, this kind of building also has doors that are left open for hours at a time when bands might be loading in, where the circus comes here. The circus gets to bring all of their large vehicles inside with animals, and sometimes bats will fly into those doors. Now, there was a study done a while back that's really kind of interesting. Turns out that bats might actually look at a shiny, hard surface like a piece of metal, or in the case of the Irwin Center here, the gymnasium floor. And they might mistake that for water. So it was kind of mysterious for a long time why bats would sometimes fly down towards the court during a basketball game. what was happening it is that bats were starving and dehydrated, and were trying to fly down on that shiny floor and get a drink of water. There's a photograph of a bat there on the right in my home that we documented doing the same thing. That floor doesn't look very shiny in this picture, but it did have a shine to it. So that's what's happening when they come out at the most unusual times. Prevention is the key. You want to solve the problems upstream, and it's a lot less expensive in the design process than it is to reacting to bats and buildings downstream. It's well worth the effort to do it from the start. A lot of people don't do that, and a lot of people are not responsible for what was done to their building at the start. That's the case with most schools. But remember that when you are excluding bats from a building, it's another form of habitat loss, which can have negative consequences for bats. That mortality is almost a certainty, even when it's done perfectly well. Now, there are a lot of degrees of bats in buildings. Sometimes it's just one or two bats in a home or an office. Now, that's not hard to solve, and all you really have to do is wait for the bat to land. Don't chase it around with a net or a tennis racket, please. Wait for the bat to land, put a box over it, and you can find information on BCI's website, including a little 10-minute video showing exactly how to do this safely to you and the bat. Sometimes there's a sudden, significant occurrence. This is somehow a major roof has been disturbed in some way, and bats can't exit normally. Sometimes the result of repairs on a roof, totally inadvertent. Sometimes it's a result of inadequate preparation for evicting and excluding bats. In other words, bats get trapped inside, and then they finally have to find a way to get into the living or working space, which is the exact occurrence that exclusion is intended to prevent. So effective bat management takes some time, some patience, takes knowledge and diligence, and it takes experience, and it takes willingness not to cut corners. Immediate solutions are bat-proofing and exclusion, eviction with tubes, and final exclusion. Long-term solutions, and this is what a lot of people miss, and I hope that I can convince some of you today that roost mitigation is one of the most important steps in a bat exclusion process. So effective bat management is, number one, a realization that every project is unique, and you're not necessarily going to use the exact same process every time. It might not be the same things that you did when this happened last time a year ago, or in a different building that you worked in. There are a lot of variables. It depends on the species. It depends on the type of building, where they're getting into that building. It depends on the time of year, and it depends on the temperature outside, the ambient temperature at the time that you're evicting bats from a building. There are a lot of challenges. It's not a hard process, but it is a process that takes diligence, it takes preparation, and it takes patience. And some of the challenges here are locating all the entry points. Sometimes it takes watching at night for a few nights in a row. You want to know the species that is in your area. What are the habits? What's the roosting and behavioral ecology of those species? You need to make sure that all bats can exit safely but not get back in. And you want everybody to be safe, including the bats. Don't assume that pups are not there or that they're already flying if it's summer. And don't assume that a very small colony is a bachelor group and not a colony with mothers and pups. Timing is important, but it's not the only thing you need to be aware of. Generally, bat maternity season in North America is about April through mid-September. But there are exceptions to that. So don't ever seal any openings unless you're absolutely sure by examining and confirming that no bats are present. And you can't always know that. I'm not saying that you can find those bats every single time. However, if there is any doubt, it's really, really important to simply wait until the weather is warmer or the rain stops or one of many things, depending on the circumstances. So waiting for an exclusion, however, sealing any openings into the inside of the building can be done at any time of year. Winter roofs are a real problem. Many people feel that during the winter you can go ahead and get the bats out, don't worry about it. But sometimes bats are in buildings. They're occasionally hibernating, but usually they're not. They're in a torpor state where they just wait out the colder weather, and then they go out and fly when it's warm enough for insects to be out. So you really can't assume, even if you don't hear or see activity for a while, that bats are not actually roosting there. Of course, evidence, many of you are quite aware of the evidence of bat guano. Certainly if there is a sizable roost, you will see guano at the bottom of where they are getting in. Bats tend to defecate before they enter a roost and as they leave a roost. So that's where you'll find guano. And you'll see staining. And you might hear vocalizations that sound like high-pitched birds chirping. And of course, you might smell guano, especially if this is a Caderata three-tailed bat species. There's a very noticeable, very distinctive odor that is associated with a lot of guano from those bats. But exclusion really is the one and only effective solution. Alternative routes are extremely important. Like I said, identifying entries and exits are extremely important for preventing re-entry. All absolutely significant when doing exclusions. As I said before, excluding bats always results in roost loss. It results always in colony displacement and often in colony fragmentation. And sometimes the population declines that can result from a badly done exclusion is masked by reports of sudden population increases at other roosts. What this really is displaced bats joining colonies in nearby structures. So it can be very confusing and it can be misleading to make assumptions about what the bats are doing and what you're seeing. Please avoid any of these methods. Glue boards, obvious for many reasons, are not recommended. Netting, lightweight netting, often people use bird netting, put up with duct tape. They can be absolutely fatal to bats. Bats can get their wings caught in those large openings. Any kind of netting is really much more complicated than an exclusion device has to be. Mothballs won't help. If you put enough mothballs in a bat roost to get the bats to leave, what's going to happen is they're probably going to get sick, and people in your building may also get sick because naphthalene is a carcinogen. Ultrasonic devices generally are a waste of money. Trap and release is not practical and not allowed in most states to capture bats. Simply closing entrances in the evening after bats leave is not acceptable because not all bats go out and forage every night for a lot of reasons, sometimes having to do with weather conditions. These are close-ups of the type of exclusion device that we prefer. And these are tubes that can be made from a lot of different materials. The ones that you see in the photograph are actually made from empty caulk containers. They're rigid plastic, but they can be cut on one end, and a flange can be made so that they can go up into all kinds of different shape and size spaces. You have to clean those out really, really carefully, however, because the idea of an exclusion device is for bats to not get back in. So it has to be very smooth on the inside, and it also has to be pointing in a downward direction. So a bat that goes up to the end of that tube is not going to be able to find purchase and get back inside. This photo on the bottom left is actually at NASA in Florida, where our colleagues at Fly By Night actually used these tubes to exclude bats from a lot of buildings at NASA. They've had bats around their buildings for a very long time, and our friends have worked with them for a long time. It works in almost all circumstances, better than netting 99.9% of the time. Bat houses, which I talked about, is incredibly important. Not always possible, but it's possible much more often than they're actually used. You can get a small one, you can have 50 bats in a bat house, or you can build a really large bat house that can literally hold tens of thousands of bats. This one is in Gainesville, Florida, on the University of Florida campus, where they did a lot of bat exclusions from buildings on their campus, and what they have now is actually 2 bat houses that are about this size and a tourist attraction. People come every night during the summer and watch the bats fly out, just like they do in Austin and surrounding areas for bats in bridges and bats in large cave colonies. Most bat-human conflicts are related to a lack of understanding or education about bats. Fear of disease is a very common reason that people really don't want bats around. Lots of that is inaccurate or at the very least incomplete and is exacerbated by media reports sometimes. Negative myths, of course, that have been around forever are another reason that people believe things that may not necessarily be true about bats. Odor and guano accumulation, noise and stains are very real things. And there are certainly times when an exclusion process is absolutely the right thing to do. Just important to do it right. This is an example of some of the media that we see, and this is actually a pretty good source. This isn't exactly the kinds of magazines that you find at your grocery store checkout. This is a report from a magazine that is well respected. And it says in its title, researchers point to bats as source for measles and mumps. Well, imagine reading that and discovering at the same time that you have bats roosting in your attic. Anyone might think, well, so now I'm going to get measles and mumps from bats. We need to get these bats out of there immediately. Turns out the measles and mumps that people are talking about in this very real study are not the same virus that infect people. They are in the same virus family, but that's very different from what this headline sounds like. Another thing you will hear, and I would like to debunk once and for all, is that it's common that people get bitten by bats without feeling it. It is not common. It is not impossible, but it is by far more likely that people will feel a bat bite, that it will feel to them very much like a needle jab. But they will perhaps not see the marks from the bat's teeth. Bats have very small, sharp teeth that are made for eating insects, and they don't even always bleed when you get a bat bite. This particular case, and that's my thumb with a couple of spots of blood that I squeezed out after a bat bite, but when I wipe the blood away, it's invisible. So that's an undetected bat bite, not one that no one felt. That's one that you didn't see as a mark on your skin. Very different. From the CDC website, most bats don't have rabies. For example, even among bats submitted for rabies testing because they could be captured, were obviously weak or sick, or had been captured by a cat, only about 6% had rabies. It's important to keep in mind that when you read statistics about percentages of bats that are positive for rabies, what you're getting is a subsection of bats that have been captured because there was something wrong. So it's obvious that bats out in the wild flying that can't be captured have a much lower percentage of rabies. Histoplasmosis is another issue that can be a very serious one. It does need to be addressed sometimes. It's a fungus that can grow on bat droppings and bird droppings. It occurs naturally in soil in certain parts of the United States, usually in river valley areas. It's less common on droppings in hot, dry attics. Histoplasmosis is common in the sense that many people are infected from it, and that is mostly from being outdoors in areas where the disease is endemic, and you can find the map for that on the CDC website. As many as 80% of persons living in U.S. areas where the fungus is common have a positive skin test. However, most of these people do not have a history of symptoms. They don't actually have the serious form of the disease. And these are some really good, reliable websites for information about rabies and other diseases. Histoplasmosis is something that can be mitigated by wearing a respirator if you're going to clean that guano, large amounts of it, from a closed area. We really recommend that people get a professional to do this, who has the right equipment, who has the right kind of respirator, which is one that locks out particles as small as 2 microns. These are other great websites for information about lots of diseases that you may or may not be able to get from that under certain circumstances. And so take a look at those if you get a chance. They are full of excellent information. Protection for bats is really lacking in the United States other than the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. And this basically means that you can't use chemicals against bats that are not labeled for use against bats. And that is all chemicals, all pesticides. So you can't do that. In Texas, you also cannot exclude bats from buildings that are not occupied by people, either homes or businesses. In other words, if it's an abandoned building or if it's something like a bridge, some kind of a structure where people don't live, that might be an illegal exclusion. However, bats that are on or inside buildings where people live or work have very little to no protection in the United States. The laws and regulations differ from state to state, but there are very few strong regulations against harming bats. Proper education is the key to this and so many other things in life. With proper education, the presence of bats in bat houses does not pose a public health risk. The best example of the truth of that is the 1.5 million bats that roost in the Congress Avenue Bridge right in the middle of downtown Austin, Texas, here where I live. They attract tens of thousands of people every summer who are in fairly close proximity to those bats as they fly out. They're just flying out down the river, just yards or feet away from people. They're dropping out from under the bridge with people standing on top watching. No human case of a bat-transmitted disease, certainly not rabies, has ever been recorded in Austin or surrounding communities. So that's a pretty good safety record for bats and people. So the truth is, simply left alone, bats are harmless and highly beneficial. They're fascinating creatures. They're vital to the balance of nature in the United States and around the world. You simply should never, ever try to handle a bat. There are posters on our website that you can download. We have one that's made to put up in school hallways. We have it in English and Spanish. And we have other resources on our website with some additional resources that should be there by the end of December or early January. We're trying to redo our bats and buildings pages to make them more useful for homeowners and people who work in schools and businesses. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
And thank you, Ms. Odegaard, for your informative discussion about proper bat control procedures. Thank you again to our presenters, John Hermanson from Cornell University, Ricardo Zubiate from Salt Lake City School District, Jeremy Thoreau from Ascension Paris in Louisiana, and Diane Odegaard from the Bat Conservation International. And to each and every one of you for participating in this webinar.